Hi, good morning. It's a good to say evening today.
Yeah, hi, hello. Good to talk to you.
Good to talk to you. It's quite a fan moment for me because I'm one of your really big fans all the way from India, following you, reading everything you are tweeting or you're posting on Instagram. So I think it's really huge for me.
Oh, wow. Well,
So
thank you very much.
so
I
good
don't
to
think I
have
really
you.
deserve it.
Oh no, you do absolutely, absolutely. I mean, you've been doing such awesome work, and that's the reason I wanted you to be live with us here for the Indian population, just so as to spread this whole message of the work, the kind of work you are doing, this whole low carb, the protein, the diabetes, all of this. I just want you to talk whatever possible. And so, if I may, Ted, I would love that you first let all of us know who are, listening to us live here, is your own journey. I know about it, but I want everybody else to know this fantastic journey of yours.
Oh, okay. So you kind of want my story, how I got to where I'm at? Okay,
Absolutely.
sure. Well, I was actually raised vegetarian. So my mother is a Seventh-day Adventist, and they are very religious people who are vegetarian. And so I was raised vegetarian, and I would say for at least the first 20 years of my life, I was a vegetarian. I went to Adventist schools. I went to Loma Linda University for medical school, which is this famous vegetarian Mecca. So I probably do know more about vegetarianism than a lot of people, whether that's good or not. But yes, I was a vegetarian. And, personally, honestly, my health was never that great, probably because my diet quality was not the best. Um, so I was raised vegetarian and I wasn't very healthy. So in the back of my mind, I thought maybe diet was not very important. And in medical school, they kind of said the same thing. They said that, of course, everyone should be a vegetarian and you should eat lots of whole grains and you shouldn't use saturated fat. You should use oil instead. But really, diet it doesn't play that big of a role. The most important thing is genetics. If both of your parents are overweight, you're just going to be overweight. And if both of your parents are diabetic, you're just going to have diabetes. And we
Mm-hmm.
were taught, what medications to prescribe and how to give people higher and higher doses of insulin
Mm-hmm.
and
Mm-hmm.
eventually deal with the diabetic complications. And then, 75% of diabetics die of a giant heart attack. And we were just supposed to feel sorry for people because it was sort of their genetics.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So
Absolutely.
here I am, with this vegetarian background and then kind of having the opinion personally and professionally that diet doesn't really matter and it's mostly genetics and you mostly prescribe medication. And I was doing my residency, this was about 20 years ago. I did a residency in a very rural, very poor part of America, which was the number one location in the United States for diabetes, which
Mm-hmm.
is saying a lot. Just tons of diabetes, really bad diabetes, lots of diabetic complications, lots of blindness and amputations and kidney failure and
Oh my
dialysis
goodness.
and all
Uh-huh.
of this heart attacks and strokes and dying and just tons of suffering from type 2 diabetes.
Mm-hmm.
um, it was really a patient of mine who made me realize how important diet could be when it came to health. I had this patient come into my clinic one day and he told me, I just lost 30 pounds and my blood sugar is normal and I stopped taking all my medication. And I was so impressed with this. I said, you have to tell me how you did this so I can, tell other patients to do the same thing. And he showed me a copy of the Dr. Atkins book. And he's like, oh, I just read this book and I stopped eating a bunch of carbs and it was really easy. I lost weight. I feel great. My blood pressure's down to normal, my sugar is normal. And this just completely changed the whole course of my life. I was like, wow, I didn't know that diet could have such a profound effect on health and so rapidly. It was really eye-opening for me. I had no idea. And I told my teachers about this, and they said, oh, well, that's great, but what happened to his total cholesterol? And I said, oh, I don't know. I didn't even look. And sure enough, it had gone up like 10 points or something. And they said, oh, yeah, no, he's going to have a huge heart attack. You're going to be sued. You absolutely cannot recommend any of this kind of crazy diet stuff to anyone ever. So that sort of started my journey. And for the past 20 years, I've really been researching diet and health. And I've been working on diet and health personally and professionally now for over 2 decades. And I've especially been focused on macronutrients and how macronutrients affect health. And that's how I kind of ended up where I'm at, basically writing the book, The PE Diet, and having a lifestyle medicine-based practice where I'm really focused on diet and exercise instead of medications for health.
Absolutely, absolutely, absolutely. And Ted, you'll be surprised to know in India, we are now sitting on a epidemic of diabetes. I think almost it's touching 80 million, 72 plus million population. And the scary thing is that maybe about 40 years back or so, it was supposed to be a disease of the rich and of the affluent. It's so scary and it's so tragic that it's hitting the rural population really badly. And as a doctor, I'm seeing the diabetes on rise in the rural population, and it's all what you just stated is now happening in our country as well, that it's costing lives, it's costing eyesights, it's costing amputations, it's just leading to so much of distress. And it's become like every other person of every other family is being hit by this disease, and we are facing so much of issues because of the COVID pandemic. And what about this chronic epidemic which is eating away at the very roots of all the generations, and it's hitting the rural population and it's hitting the younger generation. So what would you like to say if I today ask you what should be the balanced diet for a human being? Because now this balanced diet word is I think most imbalanced. So what would you like to say about it? What were we supposed to be eating so that we have a healthy lifespan?
Right. Well, yeah, I mean, everything you say, it's so tragic. India is now the diabetes capital of the
Yeah,
world,
it
and it's
is.
a
It is.
complete and total nightmare. It's a total disaster. And, everyone's pre-diabetic or diabetic, and it's really quite horrifically terrible. And the one thing I want to see everyone do is simply eat a higher percentage of protein in their diet. That's really all I'm looking for. If you look at worldwide hunter-gatherer macronutrient estimates, so hunter-gatherer societies on average are eating about 33% of their calories from protein. If you look at non-hunter-gatherer, if you look at modern humans today, the worldwide average protein percent is about 14% of calories from protein. In the US, it's more like 12.5%. And in India, it's hovering down at around 10%. And
Absolutely.
it's complete nightmare. We have studies showing that if you can get a pre-diabetic up to 30% of their calories from protein, you'll get a 100% prediabetes reversal rate. The reason why is the satiety per calorie is so incredibly high with protein. You get such a high satiety per calorie that you just stop eating. Basically, people eat until they get enough protein. And the biggest problem is refined carbs and refined fats. We have all of this flour and oil and sugar, and it's basically diluted protein in the diet, and it's adding energy, which creates diabetes, without satiety. So you're still hungry. Basically, if you eat flour and oil, you're just as hungry afterwards as if you hadn't eaten anything, but you don't get any of the protein or minerals you need. So you just keep eating. And so everyone's overeating these refined energies, these refined carbs and refined fats. If you eat an entire plant or an entire animal, you get this perfect mixture of protein and energy. So if you eat a whole egg or a whole chicken, or if you eat a whole plant, even broccoli or kale or spinach or something, where you're eating a whole organism, if you eat a whole plant or a whole animal, you're completely fine. You always get adequate protein, adequate minerals, and adequate satiety per calorie. It's when you strip the energy out of a food that you get into trouble. So like with rice, you're just eating the endosperm. It's the sugar part of the grain. It's where the grain has stored energy for the baby rice plant. And you're just stripping out that energy by itself. And maybe you even process it further and make flour out of it. And you're just eating concentrated energy from anytime you eat oil or flour and most processed grains. And this stuff is basically destroying everybody's health.
Absolutely. How did this whole concept come in? I am really curious to know, because similarly in my medical school, it was always taught that this pyramid of the carbs at the maximum level, it's still being taught in the schools all the time. And this whole concept of the breakfast being so important, and fruit juice being so important in the breakfast, and eat every 2 hours and eat fruit. I mean, now fruit is like the other thing which everybody wants to eat. And the moment you tell a pre-diabetic or a person with high triglycerides, just slow down on your consumption of fruit, or you just at least slow down on the fruit juice, they are all like, oh my goodness, what are you telling us to do? How did this whole concept come in? I'm really curious.
You can blame America for a lot of this crap. So all of the American guidelines come from the USDA, and their job is mostly to sell the commodity crops that we have in this country. So like America grows more wheat than any other country on earth, and so now all of a sudden wheat is at the base of the food pyramid. And then other countries just sort of adopted our really, really bad guidelines. So most of our guidelines really were built on selling the commodities that we grow the most. And that's terrible. So there's a huge economic factors there. Also, protein is the most expensive macronutrient by a very, very wide margin. And so it's expensive to feed protein to a whole population. It's extremely expensive. So I think that a lot of the guidelines were economic. And as I understand it, part of the reason that we see so much vegetarianism in India is economic as well. And so there are really big economic factors that are kind of huge, and almost it feels insurmountable sometimes.
Absolutely, I quite agree. And of course, in India, vegetarianism is again it's a religious belief, it's a spiritual belief, and not wanting to change people's beliefs. I mean, of course, you being a vegetarian, you realized and you shifted to a animal-based protein diet. But what about the majority of Indians who are, for example, Jains? It's the whole sect in India who are staunchly vegetarian. What do I suggest when those people come to me? Though I do try my best to suggest cottage cheese to them, but what would be your suggestion to the predominantly vegetarian population of our country? Because we have seen that they are the ones who are primarily moving into diabetes at a very rapid speed.
Well, okay, not really directly answering your question. I'm really, honestly, after my upbringing in Adventism, I'm very against hereditary religion. I think it's actually quite bad and quite harmful. And, for example, I have a daughter and I'm not pushing any religion on her at all. She can be any religion she wants or no religion. That's perfectly fine. So hereditary religion makes me sad, and hereditary religion that demands vegetarianism makes me extremely sad. And I can also empathize with that 100% because that's also who I was as well. Having said that, it's entirely possible to be even a vegan and completely be healthy and avoid diabetes. You have to go out of your way to target protein. That has to be your 100% focus every time you eat. Every single meal, every single dish, every single snack, you have to be targeting protein like it's your job. And it's very, very difficult. It's much easier if you're a vegetarian, and eggs are spectacular. So eggs should be the base of your food pyramid if you're a vegetarian. The other thing that you should really, really target as hard as you can is dairy products, especially low fat dairy or low lactose dairy. So fermented dairy is really what you're looking for. It's going to have the most protein per calorie. So paneer is great. Cottage cheese is great. Most cheeses are great. Milk itself, not as good. Milk is a fairly low protein, high energy food. It has a lot of milk sugar or lactose. It has a lot of milk fat. And it's designed to grow baby mammals into large mammals as fast as possible. So I actually don't recommend milk for anyone who has energy overload. If you're a pre-diabetic or diabetic, you're better off with a dairy product that has higher protein and lower energy, which would be fermented dairy or even low-fat fermented dairy. So, plain yogurt is excellent. Paneer is excellent. Cottage cheese is excellent. All of these fermented dairies are really, really good. The other thing that is actually not bad is legumes. So soybeans really are probably the best plant food for protein to energy ratio. Lentils are quite good. Chickpeas are pretty good. Most of your legumes are reasonable. Peas and that sort of thing. You're pretty good with legumes. You're pretty good with cruciferous vegetables like cauliflower and broccoli. If you actually look at the protein per calorie, it's pretty good. They're not really high protein foods, but they're definitely worth eating and quite good. I think there's 3 foods that if I could just snap my fingers and they disappeared from India and were totally gone, I think you'd instantly reverse the diabetes epidemic. And that would be wheat, rice, and oil. I think those are the 3 things. Sugar is bad, but actually if you look at sheer quantities of consumption, it doesn't seem to be as big a deal as the roti, the wheat that you eat in the north, and the rice in the south, and the oil, and those are the big problems. It's basically grains and oil, especially refined grains. It's just a disaster.
And I think you would definitely suggest, if possible, to add one of your favorite processed food, and that is whey protein.
I think that's perfectly reasonable. Absolutely, yes. I think that's totally fine. If you're a vegetarian or a vegan, yes, please use any kind of protein supplement you can get a hold of. It's definitely reasonable. I don't know how expensive or hard to get a hold of it would be, but it's perfectly fine, yes.
For the middle class population, I think it is quite reasonable. It is not that expensive, and again, if you compare the cost of the whey protein vis-a-vis the treatment cost of diabetes, any day, adding whey protein is far cheaper than going to a hospital for your treatment of your ongoing diabetes.
Yeah, I think you're right.
The whole issue is this another myth which has been I don't know why propagated not only in laymen, but very strongly amidst doctors as well. I've seen interviews of nephrologists, of urologists, of transplant surgeons making headlines of how protein is harming the kidneys. I just don't know, and I would like to know about you. What is your opinion? Let the people know. Does protein really harm the kidneys? And why is it being
So
propagated?
Well, first of all, no, protein doesn't hurt your kidneys at all. Protein, however, your kidneys do have to work harder for you to metabolize protein. So people on a high protein diet, they'll actually have larger kidneys, stronger kidneys, higher kidney function. Their peak kidney function filtration will be higher. It would be almost like if you're lifting weights and you have bigger muscles than someone who doesn't lift weights. Your kidneys get stronger and better if you're eating protein. It actually does not harm them at all. And, for example, bodybuilders just eat insane quantities of protein. And there are 0 case reports anywhere in the history of medical literature of any bodybuilder ever being harmed from these extreme high protein diets. It's very common for bodybuilders to exceed 50% of their calories from protein. And they're eating hundreds of grams of protein a day. And we have no case reports. They seem to have no problems whatsoever. The entire concept that eating protein harms your kidneys is completely fraudulently wrong and based on nothing. And I think people really did get the idea that, oh, look, it makes your kidneys work, so that's bad. It would be kind of like me telling you to stop running because that puts so much stress on your femurs. Like, you should never run. Think about the stress on your legs and your muscles. It's terrible. But, your legs are just a million times stronger because you run. They're stronger and better. It's spectacular. So that's kind of the analogy there. And it's a myth that needs to die. Protein does not harm your kidneys, or it really doesn't harm you at all. It's quite harmless.
Absolutely. I mean, it's such an issue. It's really so difficult for me not only to convince the laymen, but to convince the doctors themselves that it's just an ongoing topic. As the doctor population in our country is not yet believing in the value of protein, and that is something which is the most difficult thing I'm facing, because it's easier for me to convince the layman than to convince the doctor. So there's always a tussle between me as a doctor and the urologist or the nephrologist as a doctor, who would always be saying, number one, the protein is going to harm the kidneys, and number two is the other day which we were tweeting on and forth is about uric acid and the protein. And that's another thing, that the moment your uric acid goes up, of course, it's the protein. For everything, the poor protein is to be blamed for what the carbs did. So what is your take about, again, this whole thing about the uric acid and the red meat and the protein, and where is there any relationship? And if not, then what is actually responsible for high uric acid levels?
Right. So almost all elevated uric acid is a symptom of metabolic syndrome or insulin resistance. If you have insulin resistance, your kidneys retain uric acid, and you don't excrete as much uric acid from your kidneys as you should. So the vast majority of hyperuricemia or high uric acid levels or gout is due to insufficient excretion because you're over fat. Even if you look thin, if you're internally over fat and you have insulin resistance, you're not going to get rid of uric acid as well as you should. Most of the dietary advice for gout is wrong. A few things are correct. Alcohol is uniquely bad. Fructose is uniquely bad. These have to be metabolized into uric acid and you'll produce more. There's a little bit of truth to the purine story. So purines are, a high purine food has a lot of DNA in it. So if you're eating like beer, for example, beer is made with yeast. Anything made with yeast has billions of yeast organisms in it, and you're getting so much yeast DNA that's broken down into it's basically a high purine food that can slightly increase your uric acid production. So anytime you're eating a food with a very high cellularity, you're going to possibly increase your purine consumption. So anything with yeast in it is definitely bad. That's why beer is probably the worst thing ever. It's alcohol and this high cellularity purine food at the same time. Where you really won't worsen your gout at all is an acellular protein, like your whey protein, for example. You could eat all of that you wanted, and it would never make anyone's gout worse. It would basically, you're probably going to have higher satiety per calorie, and then you're going to be thinner, and then your insulin levels go down, and then your uric acid levels go down. And so protein is not the problem, especially acellular protein. So, meat is not a problem. We have studies on people going on the Atkins diet, and everyone's uric acid level goes down because they're losing weight, because they have higher satiety per calorie, because they're eating more protein. And so they don't have to eat as much. And so it's really not meat. My typical advice to someone with gout is to avoid beer like the plague. And definitely avoid sugars and alcohol. Those are probably bad. And occasionally, if you have a very small animal with a really high cellularity, like shrimp or shellfish, if you eat a ton of those, it could theoretically make your gout worse. But it's not really the protein at all that's causing that.
I have no clue how all these weird myths have spread, and our generation has spent half of our lives learning this, then unlearning and relearning. It's been quite some process.
The most damaging one of all, I think, is that if you have anything wrong with your kidneys, now you can't eat protein.
Yeah, absolutely.
And that's basically garbage. So the vast majority of people with kidney damage have either type 2 diabetes or high blood pressure.
Yeah, absolutely.
And there is no evidence at all that protein restriction is beneficial in people who have kidney failure or kidney dysfunction from type 2 diabetes or high blood pressure. And in fact, if you're eating a higher protein percentage of your diet, you're basically going to be thinner and improving your high blood pressure or type 2 diabetes. So it's a double tragedy that these people are suddenly told to eat even less protein.
Absolutely.
It's like, oh, you're a type 2 diabetic, probably because you had a low protein diet and you were overeating non-protein energy. And now that your kidneys aren't working as well due to it, we're going to tell you to watch out for protein even more. This is just such a downward spiral. It's really a nightmare. And so that's one of the biggest problems with the protein and kidney myth.
Absolutely. Even in hypertension is another such a rampant issue which our country, all of us are facing. And again, it's the same thing that they are always confused. And the hypertensives, the other myth, which is for salt, that they are all the time, being told to have less salt, less protein, and they just end up increasing the dosage of the medicines and ultimately landing into renal failure. So what is this whole myth related to hypertension and salt, and what are we supposed to actually do about it?
Oh, right. Yeah, unfortunately, a lot of stuff that we do in medicine is not really evidence-based, like protein restriction and kidney failure, or like salt restriction. So the reality is salt restriction does lower your blood pressure 1 or 2 points, while increasing your heart rate 10 points and not changing all-cause mortality at all. So it's like there's a little seed of truth there. Extreme sodium restriction will lower your blood pressure 1 or 2 points, but it's actually greatly negatively impacting your health. Also, humans eat until they get enough sodium. We have an appetite for the mineral sodium. It's one of our major appetites. So if you're trying to restrict sodium, you're probably going to end up eating more energy, and that's probably not going to help your underlying insulin resistance or metabolic syndrome, which tends to underlie all of these things. And so you're in the big picture, you're making people worse, But there is a tiny, tiny nugget of truth there, because extreme salt restriction does lower your blood pressure a point or two. And so we took that and we ran with it. It's like the protein and kidney failure. Well, there is more protein in your urine if you're eating more protein in kidney failure. And since protein in the urine is a marker of kidney damage, we took that and ran with it. Oh, well, now everyone has to avoid protein. But we missed the forest for the trees on both of those.
Absolutely. I completely agree. And it's as soon as I have faced it in my own life, because with all of us go through a particular journey, that how much the sodium, the salt helps me even when I'm working out or when I'm running. I used to I get this whole craving, and I used to always mistake it not for salt, but for the fact that I'm hungry. And a post run or a post workout, I used to look into the fridge and I have something sweet to eat, whatever possible. And after I came across all the articles written by all of you, and then I realized it's the salt. It made all the difference for the past some years. I now I automatically know that it's the salt, I'm going low, and I just have to push in some salt somewhere or the other, and I'm completely good to go and back into my intermittent fasting. And it's amazing the kind of things we have to unlearn and relearn. And coming to intermittent fasting, which is like something which is, I believe, is magical. And but the couple of questions which I would like to really know your opinion about is, number one, the role of long fast. How much are they beneficial? Should we really look into doing prolonged fasts of over 24 hours, or are fasts of about 16-18 hours perfectly fine? And what about the people like me who are working out or as well together with doing intermittent fasting? How does it all add up? And again, if we are fasting for prolonged hours, more than 24 hours or so, uh, what about the amount of protein? How do we prevent muscle loss? What happens? So I would like your views about it.
Well, I am a huge intermittent fasting fan as well. I do basically a 16-hour fast daily. I love the 16-8. I think that's the sweet spot for most people. I am especially, I think the main benefit of intermittent fasting is letting people be more fat adapted, where they're better at just living off of stored body fat. It's almost a form of exercise for your metabolism, where you get good at just living off your stored fat the way you're supposed to. So we see fat adaptation improve. It also really helps you get in touch with hunger and fullness. So you can tell when you're actually hungry. When you're actually hungry for protein, rather than just feeling your blood sugar drop from whatever carbs you ate a few hours ago.
Mm-hmm.
So it's great for fat adaptation. It's great for getting in touch with hunger and fullness and true hunger, rather than low blood sugar hunger from carbs. It's also especially helpful in people who are forced to eat more carbs in order to get adequate protein. I think a lot of people in India have to eat more carbs because they're getting so much of their protein from legumes, for example. Mm-hmm. So you're basically forced to be on a higher carb diet. So in that setting, intermittent fasting is extremely beneficial. Mm-hmm. I'm not a big fan of extended fasting. Mm-hmm. And I especially don't like people fasting for days if they're in a low protein environment, or they're starting off in a low protein place, or if they have low skeletal muscle to begin with. And India, I mean, it's kind of a disaster. About 80% of the population is protein deficient. Yes, nobody's eating enough protein. Muscle quality, it's like 70% of the population doesn't have enough muscle. And so it's this giant nightmare of not enough muscle and not enough protein. And I don't think that extended fasting is great if you're in this low protein environment, because if you're fasting over 24 hours, you probably are going to start losing some lean mass, unless you weigh 1 billion pounds and you have tons of If you have a lot of fat tissue, then you can use the glycerol backbones of your triglycerides to make plenty of glucose out of, and you might not have to burn too much protein. So if you're 500 pounds, sure, don't eat for a year. But if you're not that obese, if you're fairly thin and you're don't have a ton of muscle and you're not eating a high protein diet, you really don't want to do extended fasting. And so India is like the one place where, on a statistical level and a population level, I would not recommend fasting really over 24 hours. I like protein sparing modified fasts where, okay, maybe you just eat a little bit of protein, at least once a day, and that's it. You know what I mean? But you're still getting protein because you're going to do so much more sparing of your lean mass if you're doing that. So I do love intermittent fasting, but it's on a U-shaped curve. And as you get leaner and as you're in a lower and lower protein environment, the longer you fast, the more detrimental it is. Especially as people get older, you lose lean mass very rapidly with fasting, and you don't put it back on as easily. And you really want to hang on to all the muscle you can. So I'm not telling older people who aren't extremely overweight to ever fast over 24 hours.
Absolutely. I quite agree with you over there because I love that YouTube video of yours where you've compared type 2 diabetes to be absolutely opposite of bodybuilders. And I think the message which you have imparted through the video is really powerful and absolutely so true that the type 2 diabetes, and now if you combine them with the long fast and medium protein diet, ultimately by and by, and of course mostly nobody is doing strength training, the kind of strength training which you advocate, hardly anybody is doing, especially women. So I myself feel the same thing, that over the years they'll end up having sarcopenia, and I don't know what will be the long-term benefits. Any day it would be, as you are saying, better to fast maybe for 16 hours, and then if you are a vegetarian, at least try to take in some amount of whey protein, because the problem also which I'm seeing now with intermittent fasting is everybody has learned there's a word called intermittent fasting and they are doing. People don't know how to break it. So now there are all sorts of people who are breaking their fast with the vegans are breaking it with raw food and fruit juices. People are breaking it with oats and whatever, some bowl of porridge and oats thrown in. I think what most important together with the fasting is how we are breaking the fast and what we are eating during the feasting period. And that is where what is the latest menace which I am now observing in India, which with people who are knowing about intermittent fasting, is the way they are breaking the fast. And they are not realizing that the kind of harm they are doing, because they are breaking it with either fruit and raw food and a lot of fruit juices, or with a high carbohydrate diet. So this is something which I'm really trying to spread the awareness. And I would like, of course, a few words from your side, that what would you say is the most appropriate way to end a fast, whether it's 16 or 18 or even 20 hours?
Well, it would really just be all about the protein for me. I think the most important, the most important meal for protein is the first meal you eat after a fasting period. So it's gotta all be about the protein. It really should be every time you eat, technically, but
Technically.
especially in that first meal after fasting, the protein quantity is really what I would be looking at the most. So I know I sound like a broken record, but it's all about the protein once again.
I completely agree. Completely agree. And of course, you advocate strength training a lot, both in men and women. Between HIIT and what is the kind of HIIT would you like to suggest? Whether it's uh, the high intensity cardio stuff like burpees and mountain climbers, or it's the high intensity weight training where we should do strength training, a whole body with our squats and our lunges, or do it at a regular basis. And of course, when it comes to endurance training like long distance running, if I would want to ask you to choose between so many, a gamut of exercises, what would you say is like the most important, especially for metabolic diseases?
Probably resistance exercise. So, uh, studies show that we see more fat loss and more body composition improvement with resistance exercise than anything else. So, if you could only do one form of exercise, for me, it would have to be resistance exercise. And I'm a big fan of body weight exercises, and you can really work out your whole body with just 3 basic movements. That's pushing, pulling, and some sort of squat movement.
Yeah.
And so I'm honestly, with most of my patients, I'm really just trying to convince them to do push-ups and pull-ups to failure daily. It's so easy. It takes 5 minutes. But the difference between putting this maximum tension in your muscles on a regular basis and then never putting that kind of tension in your muscles ever is huge. Like the minute you go from doing nothing to doing something, the rewards are enormous. You get like an infinite improvement in muscle. So I'm begging people to just place maximum tension in these pushing and pulling and squatting muscle chains in their body, which is really just push-ups and pull-ups and squats. And it's pretty easy. And I think if everyone was doing that, the world would be a different place, honestly.
Absolutely. And I just loved where you have written, and you've also spoken about it, that do your push-ups to fatigue, then do just one more, then do just 3 more. That's quite entertaining. And I do try to do them very often. And yes, you can feel the difference. If you don't count your push-ups and you do it to fatigue, and then you do just the last one, which is really slow. And I think all of you and JT and all of you are focusing on this very one particular thing, that you have to do it till failure, do not count the reps.
Mm-hmm.
And
it's intensity, right? Yes, I
and
have all these people who are like, well, I do 20 push-ups every night. And I'm like, no. You do as many push-ups as you possibly can till you're going to die every night. And then do one more. Like you said, that's how it's done. Counting reps is terrible.
It's so fascinating when we read and hear all about it. And unfortunately, strength training in women in India is another thing, which is I really hardly see women doing strength training, trying to
Mm-hmm.
encourage a lot of women to start. But okay, I guess we are going to be there slowly and steadily. And the most interesting thing which I found in whatever, when I was I've been following you for quite some time, is of course your PE diet. And I found it to be really simple. And amidst so many people who have demonized carbs in a huge way, you are quite okay and comfortable with it, and you are like, okay, you could do this, or you could do this. So it's very reassuring for people like me, and for people like my daughter, who's been following the low carb diet to overcome a PCOD, and she's done it in a pretty much big way. But since she came across your PE diet, she also became a little relaxed and comfortable with her outlook towards carbs. So I would like to know more about this whole interesting concept that you have you've shared with all of us.
Right. So I'm a huge low carb fan, and I'm on a low carb diet, but the low carb people, they have a couple problems. First of all, we don't really, we try to discount people who out there who are doing great on very low fat diets. I have patients who are on extremely low fat, high carb diets, and they're doing great. The reason they're doing well, those people, however, is typically because their protein percentage is fairly high. As long as your protein percent, if you can get your protein percent up to about 20, 25%, it doesn't really matter. It doesn't seem to matter where your carbs and your fats are placed. As long as you're not eating a bunch of carbs and fats together, which tends to drive overeating because it's like addictive. That's your French fries and your pizza and your donuts and your cookies and your, refined carbs and refined fats together. As long as you're avoiding those, you can kind of get away with a high carb, low fat diet or a low carb, high fat diet, as long as your protein percentage is high enough. So I'm a little bit more agnostic. I'm telling everyone, target the protein, keep the protein really high. Watch out for refined carbs, which are terrible. Watch out for carbs and fats together, high energy density, refined carbs and fats together, like donuts. And then if you want to be on the higher carb side, that's fine. You have to watch out. You have to eat less fat at the same time. And I think that kind of flexibility you're going to need in India, where, let's say you're getting a lot of your protein from legumes, from soybeans, from lentils, from green peas. These foods have so much carbohydrate in them. You're already eating so much carbohydrate that you almost might be better off trying to keep added fat as low as possible with those meals. And then you'll still have a high protein percentage. You'll probably be just as successful with a low fat focus in those meals as you would with a low carb focus in a meal with higher fat. Like, for example, let's say here in America, I have a bunch of really fatty meat. I've got some super fatty pork or bacon. I have some super fatty ribeye. I'm eating like some fatty meat. Let's say I have eggs and steak and fatty meat. Well, I'm getting so much fat just incidentally with my protein. Basically, I have to eat so much fat that comes along with my protein that the smartest thing for me to do is focus on not eating any carbs and keeping the carbs as low as possible, because I'm already on a high fat diet to get my protein. Well, in India, it would be the exact opposite. You're getting so much come along carbohydrate with your protein from your legumes and your soybeans, and that it would almost make sense in those meals to be focused on keeping fat lower, because you're already having to eat carbohydrate just to get adequate protein. So I almost like to rotate back and forth between low carb or low fat based on how much of either macro I'm forced to eat to get adequate protein. If you gave me, steak and eggs, okay, that's going to be a really low carb meal. If you gave me lentils and chickpeas, that's going to be a really low fat meal. I'm just not going to add any fat to that because I'm having to be higher carb to get my protein. So I'm basically targeting the protein and then following whatever comes along with the protein and keeping the other macro as low as I can, if that makes sense. And but it's really all about the protein either way. If you can get your protein percent high enough, it almost doesn't matter where your carbs and fats lie, as long as you're not eating high energy density, refined carbs and fats together like a donut, because it's so addictive.
Yes, absolutely. So I think that's where a lot of times we see the weight stall on low carb, is where people are maybe just adding the protein and the fat, and both of them are in higher levels. So, and also the nuts, I think the fact that nuts are supposed to be a part of the low carb, and the nuts are so nutrient dense. Some way I also feel that some nuts are pretty much, I get addicted to the nuts if I start munching on them sometimes. So I think some of these nutrient dense foods, especially nuts, are pretty much addictive. And I think that's where the weight loss stall, or if you ask people to add a handful of nuts, the measure of the handful is never correct. So what, according to you, what are the weight loss stalls which you have observed whenever you have put your patients on a low carb?
Well, honestly, we're a little bit luckier in the United States when it comes to a low carb diet, because everyone's eating, the second you cut carbs out of your diet in the United States, you're getting a ton of protein, and it's very, very easy to just eat less. So if I'm eating just like ground beef and eggs or something, I'm getting so much protein, I cut the carbs out, it's easy. I think it's harder in India. I think it's harder for my patients in India, because what they get is the message that now they should focus on high fat dairy and nuts and oils, and they're eating butter and heavy cream and ghee and macadamia nuts and all of this fat.
Bulletproof
And
coffee.
but they never really got that protein to start out with, so they're just as
Mm.
hungry and they're having to overeat the fat, and so it's not quite as good because the base of the diet is lower in protein. So you're not getting this automatic high protein satiety the way you would if you had, I would say, just a lot more meat in your diet, for example. So,
Mm-hmm.
so I think the standard, nuts and high fat dairy keto message is a little bit less effective in India. I think on one hand, carb restriction is great because it makes you more fat adapted and you're way less dependent on all this dietary glucose. And
Mm-hmm.
that's where I see intermittent fasting also being extremely beneficial. So, uh, but like the adding fat to make it more keto, I think is basically a nightmare
Mm.
for people in India. I think that's a really bad message. I think you have to be very careful with added fats. I would avoid
Added
using
fats.
tons of butter and ghee and coconut oil and nuts and high fat dairy. And I think all of that's probably going to be problematic for a couple of reasons. First of all, because you're having to eat so many carbs to begin with, like I pointed out, to get adequate protein. And then secondly, because you're not going to have this high protein satiety just from cutting out the carbs because you weren't really eating it to begin with. So I think in America, it's easier to just cut the carbs and that's it. But I think in India, you really have to just target the protein so much harder
Protein.
instead of fat. It's all about the protein, if you know what I mean.
Absolutely. And somehow I've always have found this word, the low carb, high fat. It's uh, when it floats around in the general population, then it's always the picture of everybody picks up the high fat, and so many of the patients I know have been drinking bulletproof coffees and adding thick cream and I don't know plonking ghee on top of their big bowls of lentils, and of course rather than losing weight they've ended up gaining weight. And as you always say, I don't know, this whole word should be changed to a low carb, high protein. We
Right.
have to somehow bring across the focus. There's a whole, so many of these groups and all of these people are doing the rounds in India now. And I continuously have a disagreement with all of them when they uh, keep telling the diabetics to add fat and reduce proteins, because again this whole thing about the protein having gluconeogenesis, and so just keep your protein, the carbs less, the protein less, and just keep adding fat. Somehow it does, the HbA1c does come down, but long term ultimately will only lead into land up into sarcopenia.
Yeah,
So
I mean, I really think in India, it should be called high protein, low carb, or something like that.
absolutely.
The first focus should be more protein,
Yes.
and the second focus should be less carbohydrate. And I don't have a good acronym for that. It's not very buzzworthy, but that's really what it should be. It should really be high protein, low carb. I
Absolutely,
think that's
absolutely,
what you need.
absolutely. And could you tell us something about the psychological impacts of food and the satiety content? Because if I would, just in very short tell you a little about myself, that I was always though I belong to a non-vegetarian family, but again, the protein and the saturated fats were all demonized. So we were supposed to be having vegetarian food. And as a child, I was always plump and obese and perpetually hungry. I was one of those, I think I had the toxic hunger. And
Mm-hmm.
uh, so what is this? There are people who can have small meals, whether they are nutritionally empty, but they do reach that satiety without that sodium, without the protein, without the fat, eating. completely nutritional dense food, and they end up being supposedly normal weight, but of course we all know being landing up into the skinny fat. But then there are people like me, like how I was as a child, that we are never satiated till I started adding protein, which and intermittent fasting, which just brought about this magical change in my life. So how does this happen that there are people who would have the small even if they are having a donut, for example, or an ice cream, which um, for me it would never be, I would never be satiated, and I would always want to eat at a second or a third helping. But there are some individuals who are fine with that, and then they stay on that hypocaloric diet kind of a thing. So how does this happen? Is it all the wiring in the brain? What's actually going on?
Okay, so most humans have this incredibly powerful protein satiety drive where you'll eat and eat and eat and eat until you get enough protein.
Mm-hmm.
And we might see the amount of calories people eat go up by a factor of 10 in certain people to get enough protein to not be hungry. So we see these huge protein satiety drives. But more to your point, about 15% of humans are never going to overeat, even if they're in a low protein environment or if they're in a there's some people, and we all know someone like this. They're like a human cockroach. They could just live on Twinkies and donuts, and they would be effortlessly thin, and they would never be overweight. This is completely genetic. So this is a genetic phenomenon. These people, if you told them, I will pay you $1 billion if you can get to 300 pounds. If you can eat your way to 300 pounds, here's $1 billion. You'll be they couldn't do it. They absolutely could not do it. There's no force on earth that would allow them to do that. Some people will just remain extremely lean on a diet of abject garbage. And the problem with these people is that if you try to copy what they're doing, it's not going to work for you.
Mm-hmm.
It would be like if I saw a 7 foot tall basketball player and he said, well, my secret is, just eating Oreos every day. I just eat, 100 Oreos. And I would try to eat 100 Oreos so I could be 7 feet tall and play basketball really well. It's not going to work. So there's just 15% of people who you cannot pay any attention to their weight or what they're eating because they would be that thin even if they just ate just like sugar and oil mixed together. I mean, it doesn't really matter. These people are kind of confounders because that's just the way they are constitutionally, genetically. And so you kind of don't want to pay attention to. A lot of people are like, wow, I'm going to try eating what that person's eating and maybe I'll be just as skinny as can be my whole life. No, that's not going to work.
I know, but those people are, I mean, really, they are confounders, and everybody has them as friends and as families, and
we hate those people.
No, I don't.
Yeah,
I don't. I'm very happy now because I know that the kind of strength training I can do, they're constitutionally pretty much weak, and I think by
right.
the time they become our ages, they become very much prone to low immunity and to be hit by all sorts of lifestyle diseases. But yes, the teenagers do have it tough because it's very common in the teenage population that there are some really skinny teenagers who are
Mm-hmm.
living off the refined carbs the whole day, not putting on a single kg, and there are other teenagers who would be just piling on weight. So it's, I think
Right.
the whole body concept becomes very tough there.
It's very hard because I'm sure your daughter is like, well, look, this girl just eats candy bars all day and potato chips, and she's 98 pounds, and
Absolutely.
but that's just purely genetic. So I think, like you said, though, however, eventually that catches up to these people when
It does.
we see more sarcopenia, osteopenia, dental disease, all these complications of suboptimal diet, even though their body fat stays low permanently, and a lot of them, they'll get skinny fat or under muscled or something.
Yeah, absolutely. They're land up into a very huge number, as much as the obese population does. So
Mm-hmm.
I think, it's been, I think I have covered most of the questions, and uh, I think it's been, there's one typical question which people also keep asking is about, again, what exactly is ketosis, and whether it's safe for the diabetics to be in, or would you recommend them to be in ketosis? What is your take on it? This is one
So
question which.
basically, you're making ketones anytime your insulin levels are really low. So generating ketones is just a sign that you're releasing fat or burning fat. It doesn't necessarily mean that you're losing fat from your body. For example, okay, let's just say you eat no carbs at all. Great. You're forced to burn exclusively fat, and you will be generating ketones. This is good. But then whether you lose weight or gain weight comes down to fat balance. If you eat more fat than you're burning, you're going to gain weight. So you can be on a strict ketogenic diet, but if you eat enough butter and heavy cream, you'll literally gain weight and be in a significant ketosis the whole time. So I never recommend that people, test ketones or track ketones, or like, honestly, never in my medical practice do I even use the word ketogenic diet. I don't
Mhm.
tell people to track their ketones. I don't really care how much ketosis they're in. I find that people who are, really successful, losing weight, very fat adapted, exercising a lot, their ketone levels tend to be fairly low.
Mhm.
They're never in a really high ketosis, even if they're, fasting. So it's not that helpful to try to get the highest possible score.
Absolutely.
It usually means you're inefficient at using ketones, or you overeat fat or something like that.
Communication.
So I'd never tell people to chase ketones or ketosis. It's not that helpful. Having said that, it's perfectly safe and perfectly fine and perfectly great, unless you have insulin deficiency. If you have pathological insulin deficiency, either type 1 diabetes or any kind of autoimmune component to a type 2 diabetic, or a pancreatic burnout where you have insufficient insulin. If your ketones get really, really high, it's acidotic, and that's dangerous, and that's ketoacidosis. But nobody has to really worry about that unless they're insulin deficient, or rarely with some of the SGLT2 inhibitors like Jardiance and Invokana, and these new drugs where you pee out 100 grams of glucose a day. Sometimes that will basically increase your ketone production so high that you get like a normal glycemic ketoacidosis. But for the most part, being in ketosis is fine. It's great. It's not something you have to chase. I think at one point, every human on earth was on a cyclical ketogenic diet,
Hmm.
where you went periods
Absolutely.
of time, either hours or days or weeks or months, periods of time where you were in a low energy environment in terms of your diet, and you had to be in ketosis. And I think that's a very healthy metabolic state.
Absolutely.
And I think the modern diet is specifically anti-ketogenic. It's like we're
Mhm.
going out of our way to never be in ketosis. The average
Absolutely.
American eats 300 grams of carbs a day.
Oh my goodness.
Every 2 hours, we eat carbs 8 times a day in a 16-hour eating window. And it's the most ketone suppressive thing you could ever imagine. And we started off in the morning with breakfast. It's like
Mhm.
breakfast is cereal and juice and toast. And we just suppress the hell out of any ketosis with all this dietary glucose. And then you're hungry 3 hours later,
Oh,
and you have a
absolutely.
snack that has a bunch of crappy carbs in it, and you're just on this carb roller coaster where every 2 hours for 16 hours you're eating carbs, and it's a complete nightmare. And so anything you can do to not be on an anti-ketogenic diet is great. So I do want people to be in ketosis periodically, but I don't think you have to, measure it or check your blood levels or try to get the
Mhm.
highest score possible or something like that.
And what about this role of MCT oils? It's come in such a big way. People are adding it to their coffees, and I personally don't see any logic of adding MCT oils. But what is your take on the adding MCT oils to your?
I I
coffee and
don't
stuff.
like it at all, and I don't recommend it. Basically, it's just completely empty calorie
Hmm.
energy. Takes you 2 hours to, metabolize a tablespoon of MCT oil, and so you're really just displacing fat oxidation from your body. And now that
Wow.
91% of Americans are over fat, and so most people don't want to be eating any extra fat because they're already trying to get rid of the fat in their body. So I like restricting carbs so you're burning the fat in your body, but I don't like adding empty calorie
Absolutely.
fat. And so MCT oil would be the emptiest calorie fat you can get. It has no protein, no minerals,
Nothing in it.
very calorically dense, very low satiety per calorie. It's the exact opposite of what most people want or need. So I'm not a fan of adding refined fats to anything really, especially your
Absolutely.
coffee. Don't I don't recommend it.
Absolutely.
Spend
I think
something.
I'm completely in sync with your thoughts here, because it's just completely, according to me also, the whole purpose is lost of being fasting or trying to utilize your own body fat for ketosis. And unfortunately, this whole too early thing which you talked about, and the fact that the breakfast is the most important and the cereals, the scariest thing, Ted, I'm seeing is the schools, the children. I'm just so scared by what is happening with our children. And look at India now. We never used to have, our children were never obese, and they were pretty much active and doing physical activities, and a slender build. And now look at the population of children. There's an explosion of childhood obesity, childhood fatty liver. We are seeing fatty liver in 18, 20 years old.
Mhm.
I mean, how do we tackle it? It's they are first, their parents lovingly stuff bread, jam, and Nutella. The butter is not eaten because butter is not supposed to be good. So they are stuffed bread, jam, and Nutella in the mornings. Then they are hungry at for 2 hours, and they have the tiffin break where they are given some juice, some whatever, some cereal, some snack. Then there's the lunch break. Then there's the tea snack, where mostly the schools which have boarding and everything, they are again given their compulsory packet of healthy juice. Then there is some more snacks, and then there is dinner.
It's a nightmare. It's the
It's a
same way in
nightmare.
America.
I mean, what is happening? And I fail to understand how to tackle the situation, whether to educate the school or to educate the parents and the poor children.
It's a nightmare. I mean, well, first of all, you have to basically lead by example. And, I'm sure that, you're leading by example all over the place. And I think that's the way to go. You basically have to educate kids like how they should eat. My daughter, for example, like she's just exposed to all of this crap food and all these snack times and everything. And she's really kind of bewildered at the behavior of other people. And what we do at home is we just have tons of really high quality protein foods everywhere. So, she might eat, almost a pound of salmon for dinner and or something like that. And then she's just so not hungry. Like she'll skip she
Exactly.
frequently just skips breakfast. She's like, I can't believe everyone's eating breakfast. I'm not even remotely hungry. She skips snack time. She's just eating like just eats so less often and so much less food
Hmm.
because the quality of what she gets at home is so much higher. And then it just amazes her that people are having to eat so much and so often because the quality of their food is so low. And it's really all about the protein percentage, honestly. That's the
Absolutely.
most important factor. So if you're eating this super high quality, high protein food, you're just not hungry and you don't need all these crazy snacks. And you're just so much better off. But it's about education and knowledge and leading by example, and then surrounding people with really high quality, high protein food, which is kind of hard to do sometimes.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I guess it's just I feel very scared for our the population, because just today I had somebody told me that, okay, I ate this, and some potatoes for when I broke the fast. So I was like, okay, everything was pretty much good, but where did the potatoes come in from? So, oh well, they were boiled for my daughters, making some sandwiches, something. So I was like, well, you are eating something really good. You had omelets and you had a coffee and you had a pretty much good breakfast, but why were you making potato and white bread sandwiches for your 3-year-old daughter? Oh, well, she is too young to be put on a diet. So difficult to convince the parents that this whole, the worst is the jams and the Nutellas and the cereals, and they're just, it's just so scary. It's so tragic.
It's
So, well,
bad. I mean, luckily kids have a higher carbohydrate tolerance than we adults do, and that's the only reason humans aren't extinct by now. But yeah, the only reason we're still alive is because these kids have a slightly higher tolerance. But it's not going well. It's getting worse. It's a nightmare. It's a disaster. This is
absolutely,
bad. Like
absolutely.
it's obesity in America is just a complete disaster. Like the average male in America weighs 198 pounds and
Oh,
has a 40-inch waist. That's the average adult male in America, 198. It's like 198 pounds and a 40-inch waist. It's
oof,
just total nightmare. It's
it's a nightmare.
oh, yeah,
we, we,
we're
we are
screwed.
also progressing pretty much rapidly along that direction, and I'm glad that you brought up this topic of the weight and the pounds and the inches, because there's one very important question which someone has asked me about the body composition and the body fat index. And what do you think, should we be measuring it, or is there any simple formula which we could just, you know, that's how we could live our lives across? Or would you like and what about all these machine compositions? A lot of machines are there in the gyms which are taking out the body compositions. I think only DEXA scan can really give you the correct body compositions, but what is your take on that?
I my favorite metric is waist circumference.
Mm-hmm.
So I love waist circumference, and I specifically like waist to height ratio.
Mm-hmm.
So you measure your waist right at the belly button with your abdomen completely relaxed, and that better be less than half your height.
Mm-hmm.
So your waist, if your waist should be less than half of your height, and I that's my favorite metric. I do. It gets a little trickier in some people who are extremely skinny fat. So I do have a lot of patients from India, and a lot of them will become diabetic when they're just 5 pounds over fat, or just some tiny, tiny amount of over fat. You know what I mean? At a much lower fatness than in America. And so it's a little tricky because some of these people will just barely have too high a waist height ratio, but they're fully diabetic. But I still
Mm-hmm.
think that's one of the best metrics I've got. It's one of the
Mm-hmm.
best things to track. Uh, the impedance scales are not terribly accurate, but they will tell you whether you're going up or down. So it's way better than nothing. So weight is better than nothing, but kind of crappy. Impedance is better than nothing, but not very good. DEXA nobody can afford, so it's basically might as well not exist.
Mm-hmm.
And waist to height ratio is my favorite.
Waste to hydration. Absolutely, absolutely. I think we've really had a fruitful discussion about discussing. There, are, of course, a lot of topics yet untouched, and I think I would definitely love to have you again here with me, especially this whole statins and cholesterol myth. But then that's another huge topic in itself. And I would just maybe like to invite another huge fan of yours, who's Michelle, and she's a very good friend of mine, and she's uh, trying to exactly do all of this in India. She's alongside with me, working very hard to make social awareness. Michelle, could Michelle's audio be put? Uh, could Michelle's audio be switched on, please?
Yes, Dr. Avi,
Michelle
she would be
Sikora.
joining. Yes, she is
And
joining
if
as a.
and if Dr. Rupal is she there? Dr. Rupal, if she's there, do please. I don't know whether she was here a while ago. So this is my very good friend Michelle, who is
Hello.
also
Ted.
being
Hi.
mentoring me. She's active with intermittent fasting and extremely good with her high protein and low carb. And another, I think, huge fan moment for her as well.
Yeah, right. So
And her son was. I think I sent you a question across also from her son, who's I think your youngest fan from India.
Oh, okay.
Oh, yeah,
so
Michelle, there's any question you would like to ask?
yeah, Ted. So, firstly, thanks so much. Thanks to you and Pallavi for addressing so many questions. And I like the way you both like specifically focus towards the Indian population, without just talking about bacon and eggs. And your book is excellent. And my son is a huge fan of yours. And I think I also have a question. He also shared a question. I think it's both combined together. In a recent tweet, you mentioned that we can only get halfway to a desired body fat percentage.
Right.
And and you said that even you find it very difficult to maintain your body fat percentage.
Mm-hmm.
So you've also said in a couple of other tweets saying that after a certain point, when we've really had our weight loss and our maintenance, there's a set body fat percentage below which we cannot go, and if we go, it's like really difficult to maintain. And I
Right.
think here I talk about myself. I know a lot of my clients as well, and a lot of people who are into low carb, high protein for a long period of time, and also my son. So he plays football. He's like 5'9", I think 180 centimeters. He's just 160 pounds. So he's not overweight at all. He's like almost carnivores. So his wish is to be take pictures shirtless like you, and probably post on Instagram. But this also includes me, where it's been 4 years. I'm like perfectly managing my body weight, but then there is that 2 pounds of visceral fat. Just that's it. And for some it's on the thighs or arms. So I really want to understand, so that like what's this whole concept.
Okay, well, two things. First of all, the biggest factor is genetics. The biggest factor is genetics. Most abs are genetic. So if you look at bodybuilders who have phenomenal abs, you can go back and look at pictures of them when they were 6 years old, or when they were 10 years old, or when they were 15 years old, and they've got abs in those pictures. This is just like genetic. They have very little subcutaneous fat on their abdomen. They effortlessly walk around with less subcutaneous fat cells and less filled subcutaneous fat cells than the rest of it. It's purely genetic. And then you'll see other people who, even as a kid, they were fatter, and as a teenager, they were fatter, and as an adult, they're fatter. These people maybe will never have visible abs. They might starve themselves. They might die of protein calorie malnutrition and still have barely visible abs. So it's so genetic. It's not even fair. Like nobody, the only, well, okay, I have to admit, I did not have abs before. I was definitely over fat. And so I did lose enough weight for them to be visible, but but how visible your abs are is mostly genetic, and it's not fair and it's not cool, but it's genetic, really. But the other factor is getting as lean as you can within your genetic limitations. And so anyone can get just mind-blowingly shredded temporarily if you just, went on some crazy bodybuilding cut where literally all you ate is chicken breast and broccoli. You would just be dying, but you could probably get your body fat down to, maybe 14% as a female and stay there just for a few weeks, and then you would absolutely have to gain weight again. So there's this set point below which your body does not want to go. All of your fat cells want to stay at least 40-50% filled with fat because that's their job. And you can drive them below that, but it's just painful. It's so painful. The ghrelin is so high. You're just starving. You're starving out of your mind. So there's this set point where you will not be able to go below, and that's where your body wants you to be. Now, you can get as low as possible in your genetic limits with an extremely high protein percentage diet and a really high quality diet. You want to eat foods that have the very highest satiety per calorie, and those are all extremely high in protein and minerals. Foods like whey protein, fish, chicken breast, green vegetables. These have phenomenal high satiety per calorie. If you just eat nothing but these foods, if all you eat is chicken breast and fish and salad and stuff like that, you can get as lean as possible. But then there's this point where if you try to live below that, you're just so hungry, you can't do it. Gradually over time, you can kind of get lower and lower and lower. Like it took me years to be able to walk around at maybe going down from 12% body fat to maybe 11 or 10. So I kind of have visible abs, but it just took years of slowly whittling down my body fat set point by just focusing every time I ate on the highest protein and the highest satiety per calorie and just avoiding refined carbs and refined fats. And so it's really painful and it's really difficult, and nobody ever gets to walk around as thin as they would like to be. Like, that's just not happening. That is not happening for anyone. Even your bodybuilders will get way, way down for a show or a photo shoot, and then they have to walk around at like 12% for men and 20% for women, like everybody else. So there are these limits that you just can't really long-term sustainably go below. And if you were ever significantly over fat, if you're ever like really fat, you have this adipocyte hyperplasia where you have way more fat cells, and every one of those cells wants to be at least 40 or 50% filled with fat. So you're just going to walk around with a higher body fat percent than someone who is never fat, if you know what I mean.
Yes, absolutely. Because what actually happens, the fat cells, I think, do they ever go away, or they are just
it takes about 9 or 10 years for these fat cells to involute or go away. So, if you were, super, super over fat and you had tons of adipocyte hyperplasia where you got lots of extra fat cells, you just have to slowly, painfully shrink them down. And if they're unneeded for like a decade, they'll eventually sort of go away. So you can eventually, it gets easier and easier and easier to walk around with lower and lower body fats. But it's really very long. It's a very long process, and it's very slow, and it's very painful. And you have to be kind of pushing into this almost hunger discomfort to get there. You can't be eating fat to satiety every day and every meal. You have to really, it's a war of grams every day. Like every day you're trying to eat just a few grams less fat or a few grams less carb. And so you're constantly shaving down the energy off of the proteins that you're eating, basically. And it's it's not easy. Mostly, but like I said, the number one factor is genetic. There are people who just have, both their parents are super thin no matter what they eat, and they're going to be super thin no matter what they eat. And they might have, just excellent abs on like a diet of garbage. And so there's such huge genetic factors. It's really not fair. The same goes for building muscle. You have to have the right genetics to have a lot of muscle or be a bodybuilder. And some people could do optimal resistance training their entire lives and still build almost no muscle at all. I mean, it's so genetic. You can't overcome it. So you have to be aware of your genetic limitations, but you still want to be the best version of yourself you can be. Everyone can have the highest lean mass they're capable of at the lowest fat mass they're capable of, no matter what their genetic limits are. And that's what your goal should be.
Yes, I think I really appreciate this, that we have to be the best versions of whatever we are capable of. For example, like for menopausal women, it's really a struggle, because with all the hormones going haywire, it's quite a struggle. And most of the women above the ages of 40, 45, 50 face this issue all their lives. And I think that's something awesome, which I think the take home key message of today is be a better version of whatever we are
Right.
capable of. We
There you go.
can't
Yeah.
absolutely. And I think a couple of other questions which I think it's people should be, all those who have been asking all these questions, please do purchase the book, read it, and even if you are unable to get the book, couple of them have written that it's not available on Amazon in India. Few of them have written. So at least, follow Dr. Ted Naiman on Twitter, on Instagram, and you'll get the answers of most of your questions. But there's one interesting question which somebody has posted, is that they say that, and in fact, a lot of my clients say as well, I don't know what about you, Michelle, that if they are taking a higher protein diet, they feel that they are getting constipated. And
Hmm.
I, of course, do suggest them to take magnesium supplements and to add more water. But what is your insight on that?
Yeah, I'm not really aware of any major association between higher protein diets and constipation. And typically, my number one advice is more magnesium in the diet somehow, or maybe magnesium and potassium. But I that's not a problem I really encounter very often. So I'm not even sure what to say. I don't know why a higher protein diet. In practice, it doesn't seem to cause that much constipation
I
in
feel
my
that
patient
because
population.
people are on a high carb diet, they are basically not feeling thirsty, and their thirst appetite goes down, and they don't drink enough water. Because when I tell them to drink water, they are like, okay, we are maybe like having a couple of liters of water, which maybe I would be drinking off during my workout in the morning itself. So that's where I think the moment you let the carbs go down, and you don't increase your water and their thirst appetite completely suppresses. I've seen people can sit for hours on end and not have water. So I think that's where the whole situation. And of course magnesium, because again, nobody in India knows about the value and importance of magnesium supplements. um, that is another quite a gray area out here, and we are trying to focus a lot on that.
Yeah.
So
Right.
yeah,
So,
I think it's, thank you again. It's really been a very, very, fruitful session, and I intend to, make this as much live as possible, post it on on YouTube, and share it with people as widely as possible. Because personally, I feel that this whole pandemic wouldn't have reached this horrible out of proportion levels if most of us were at a good metabolic health. And it's just caused immense destruction. Thanks to, it just goes to show the quality of metabolic health we all are sitting on. So I do hope it's awakening of sorts, and I do hope we let go of our egos, and all of us, literally, I mean, you learned and relearned and unlearned, and all of us are trying to do the same. So we need to keep our egos in check and leave the egos at the doorstep, and try to understand what is going on, and what's going on with our bodies. And I'm sure this video is going to really help a lot of people around. And thank you for gifting me and Michelle this fan moment.
Oh, thank you. No, this is great. This is awesome.
yeah, thanks,
and
Ted. Thank you.
and
Thanks to
it's and
Pallavi.
thank you, and thank you for your time. And I'll be sharing this as soon as the YouTube is made. I'll share it with you. And thank you so much for your time. It's a Sunday morning. I've really taken quite an amount of your time, and I hope you have a good Sunday ahead.
Oh, no,
Thank you
same to
so
you.
much.
It's great to meet you, and thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thanks,
Greetings
thanks,
and
Ted.
namaste from India.
Namaste.
Thank you so much. Bye.